Our next speaker is Professor Deina Abdelkader. Deina is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and Director of Peace and Conflict Studies. You just have to switch to PowerPoint.
Thank you. Thank you, CSID, for inviting me to speak today. I have known Dr. Radwan since 2003. I remember that the first mission with CSID was in Khartoum, Sudan, and upon arrival, we were shocked to know that Turabi was in jail. And so a lot of the people who were coming to the conference unfortunately left and did not attend. My talk today is general, a lot more general than my colleagues. I will talk basically about the challenges that Islamic parties and any really political opposition comes up against. So basically, let me begin today's presentation by saying that not only is there contestation about defining the Middle East as a region, but also the definition of democracy as this panel started, and what democratic transition entails is also contentious. But let us assume that we agree roughly on the regional definition and focus, therefore on democratic transition. A major detractor from forming a common theoretical agenda for democratization is the fact that methodological specialization has encouraged conceptual and theoretical divergence, and that divergence has eased our balkanization into different methodological camps. As one of the famous democracy theorists, Robert Dahl, says, talks about polyarchy, which has limited convergence of theorists, utilizing procedural democracy from other theorists who work with participatory democracy. That is to say, the theorists who are more focused on the informal, non-institutional forms of democratic expression. Thirdly, the political history of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East is comparatively under-theorized. Therefore, expanding into non-Western regions is obviously needed. Fourth, thin theory, and I will explain what thin theory is. It is basically data that is quantifiable in order to generalize the findings at the expense of specificity and relevance. Does not capture that, for example, in Egypt and other Arab countries, social movements have very limited resources and weak formal organizations. Which brings us to another issue with comparative democratization, and that is the analysis of informal networks and innovative repertoires to mobilize that are not accounted for. An example of that is post the Egyptian Revolution. The April 6th movement was invited to MIT to talk about how they organized. And they basically, the members said that they pretended to call on their cell phones when they're in public transportation, whether they're in taxi cabs or the metro. They picked up their phone, not having anybody else on the other side, and said, you know, we're meeting in downtown Egypt on such and such a date at such and such an hour. No, there are no studies that take recognition of this informal way of organizing. And this is one of the theoretical problems. Given that social movements and civil society organizations are oppressed and restricted with varying degrees in the region, and that they lack major political openings, it is particularly interesting to observe and analyze how those societies operate through those restricted spaces to aspire and demonstrate for political rights. I'm in total disagreement with cultural exceptionalism as an explanation of social mobilization in the Arab Spring in general, or in the Muslim world more broadly. That is to say, I take context as a central factor in understanding how informal networks in the Middle East and North Africa operate and how actors among them calculate their actions. The implication that Japan and the Middle East and North Africa may share comparable forms of local networking does not mean that there is an essential East-West divide on this or other matters. Rather, it is an understanding that the West may not be as rational and instrumentalist as many have imagined it to be. Second, theoretically, most modeling in comparative politics and political science as a whole is built on the global north, and therefore southern regions become the outliers in what is assumed to be the norm politically. What comparative democratization needs is the realization that regional cases also could contribute to the classical questions of social mobilization and democratic transition. That is to say, the Global South also needs to theoretically be included in our studies of all things political. Contemporary politics are full of examples that currently prove that the universality of certain political concepts is challenged every day. It is time then to be inclusive of those experiences to enrich our thin theories and recognize that comparative politics or democratic transition theories are not unilaterally defined. Third and last, it is important to note that categories like nation, class, and even Islam, like my colleague Jocelyn said, are inherently problematic and should always be contextualized. Generalization then, or grand theory, becomes hazardous in capturing highly contested definitions such as Islam, democracy, modernity, etc. Specialists of the Middle East region are facing what I call a paradigmatic and methodological crisis. Transition theories and post-transition theories have a striking incapacity to theorize the role of local cultures, historical contexts, and national interest groups. So this is a set of problems. A second set of problems is what I call the national level obstacles. And the first that I'm going to address here is the military's role in democratic transition. The military is one of the oldest and strongest institutions in the political arena, yet it is forgotten in many ways as the pivotal cause for change from above by most of the literature, especially in democratic transition literature. Explaining the variation in the responses of militaries to the outbreak of protest, therefore, is vital to understanding the overall course of the Arab uprisings. It is also important to note that with the little attention paid to the institution, and the fact that the institution itself burrowed with different degrees in the Arab world, it also became highly secretive to the detriment of researchers trying to gain accurate information about the military. As an institution, the military in Egypt has exhibited power and economic existentialism. The military as a political player is also involved in regional politics as well as politics with the United States. So we talk about power, and as observed in a lot of the literature about the Egyptian revolution, the army's hold on power is so relentless that even Mubarak had to establish a strong police force in his attempt to hand over power to his civilian son, Gamal Mubarak. Although Mubarak was part of the military, but his attempt to switch power to a civilian candidate existentially threatened the military's power, and therefore the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, SCAF, assumed control over the country on February 10th, and the next day persuaded the reluctant Mubarak to resign. Economically speaking, the second sort of linchpin or causal factor that affects existential conflict and the result that to the Egyptian military are economic interests. The military's economic involvement is so entrenched that no political force that could stop them. There is no political force that could stop them. Since 2011, the armed forces have increasingly taken on the biggest infrastructure projects, as is evident just this past week with the removal of holy burial sites and spaces to build more bridges and infrastructure. Another factor on the domestic level is, and I'm sorry for the mistake, it's antagonistic secularism. Although Western liberalism is partially built on the acceptance and respect of others, the observance of pluralism and the protection of both, liberalism in Egypt pre and post the 2011 revolution, and I would say this is very generalizable, whether we talk about Tunisia or Turkey, for example, they antagonistically reject and refuse to coexist with what it views as its main rival, Islamically oriented politics and parties. Quintessential liberalism is defined by the rejection of a privileged class, religion, or national origin. However, secularists in Egypt have basically argued and acted on their assumption that they are privileged holders of the truth politically, socially, and economically. Historically speaking, the liberals in Egypt have copied the Orientalist discourse. What distinguishes those secularists was that they uncritically replicated European anti-Arabism and the debasement of the Arabo-Islamic culture. Their liberalism was non-inclusive of the masses, which is still true today in the aftermath of the 2011 Egyptian revolution. The secular liberal reformers who emphasized rationality and individualism were paradoxically trapped in the cultural order of the other, and therefore could not provide an inclusive notion of national identity and an emancipating notion of political community. The last of the problems and issues here is the entanglement of domestic and international obstacles, specifically U.S.-Egyptian military relations. In March 2014, General Lloyd Austin III, who was the commander of the U.S. Central Command, called Egypt an anchor state. In other words, Egypt is too important to let go, no matter what happens inside it. The best proof of this statement is in the numbers. In 2012, more than 2,000 US military aircraft flew in Egyptian airspace. Up to 45 US Fifth Fleet naval ships passed through the Suez Canal annually. Cutting aid would push Egypt into the hands of anti-Western groups, and neither the United States nor the State of Israel can afford that. This is what he said. When the revolution took place, the United States was hesitant to withdraw support from Mubarak, and although the crackdown on the revolutionaries was brutal, bloody, and internationally televised, it took the United States and Europe a while before they timidly supported the revolutionaries. It was out of international embarrassment and not due to realpolitik calculations that the United States succumbed to the interests of a whole nation. Arms sales and financial aid still continue today without interference, although it is no secret that the regime has caused an unsurpassed amount of bloodshed and incredible human rights violations. In hindsight, the United States' position never changed, because although the Arab world received a disproportionate amount of US funding to promote democracy, it received virtually no support to enhance civilian control of the militaries. The one study of Arab civil-military relations, financed before the Arab Spring by the United States Agency for International Development, noted that politically important role of Arab militaries and their absorption of record shares of public budgets, but it questioned, quote, and this is really important because it ties in with a lot of what has been said in other panels, the rightness of many countries in the region for major programs in civil-military relations. Okay. This is very similar to colonial policies justifying occupation because the indigenous peoples were not ready to rule themselves. So first, the military in Egypt, as in many Middle Eastern countries, has total control of power, power sharing by civilian institutions, or a balance of power between the military and civilian institutions is unheard of. This balance has come about in other transitions, especially in Latin America, through the United States interference. The United States Department of Defense Center for Civil-Military Relations has played a vital role in raising political consciousness and providing necessary information for effective civilian control of the armed forces. Second, the military is highly suspicious of civilian involvement in the economy, and their expertise does not go beyond domestic production and sales of goods and services. However, what is needed for an economy to survive is to be able to navigate basically a global economy. In conclusion, I would like to highlight 2 points. First, theoretically, the field is going through an identity crisis. Whether we talk about comparative politics as well as comparative democratization, it is being forcefully pigeonholed to build grand theory, which by definition is opposed to cultural and historical contexts and nuances. Secondly, also analysts are not linking the domestic level of analysis to the international level of analysis. Thirdly, there is a negligible amount of literature on the agency of political actors in the Arab Spring, which is linked to a bias in the literature, namely the divide between what is rational versus irrational, secular versus religious. Second, the arguments used by the secularists in the 20s and the 30s have not changed a bit. The Egyptian liberals hold that in a culturally backward society, the masses do not have the capacity to make meaningful choices. So it is very dangerous to obliterate one side of the population, especially the majority, from political participation and discourse. Social movement theories indicate that change can occur from above or from below. If one does a comparative study of the region, Egypt in particular, historically has been resistant to change from above. Whether one takes Qasim Amin, Huda Sha'rawi as feminists, or Nasserism as a National Socialist experiment, neither feminism from above nor socialist Nasserism gained traction as ideas that mobilized the masses. In examining the history of the Muslim Brotherhood as a social movement, they, on the other hand, gained traction as a movement, and their ideas were popularized because they addressed the real needs of the people: free healthcare, free education, free transportation, etc. The underscoring of social justice lies at the heart of this great divide, because as my presentation has illustrated, the divide between the elites, elite interest groups and the masses is complex. This divide is also based on the kind of education they received. So the power vacuums, coming back to the United States, power vacuums and destabilization are dangerous weapons, as we have known in terms of our foreign policy through the examples of recently Afghanistan and Iraq. But to put it, all those factors, basically, the three levels of analysis that I've been discussing, the theoretical, the domestic, national, and the international factors, all have to click in the right direction. They are like cogs of a machine. If they are not all aligned right, democratic transition becomes an impossible goal. And if we compare that to the United States or Great Britain, when they were seeking to democratize their societies, this laundry list of challenges was not totally 100% there. Right? So for any society to democratize today in the developing world as well as the MENA region, it is very difficult goal to attain. Thank you.